Picture a woman whose only crime was saving a dying child's life, dragged from her home by a torch-wielding mob and burned alive before sunrise. Imagine someone who spent years helping her community through illness and childbirth, suddenly branded as a servant of Satan because her healing knowledge seemed too powerful to be natural. This is the true story of Margot de la Barre, a French healer whose miraculous cure of a nobleman's son triggered a witch hunt that ended with her screaming death at the stake just hours later. What happened on that terrible night in 1491 reveals how quickly fear and superstition could transform a beloved healer into a condemned witch, and how religious hysteria could turn an act of mercy into evidence of demonic conspiracy. Before we witness one of history's most unjust executions, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because Margot's story shows how dangerous it was to be a woman with knowledge in medieval Europe. Margot de la Barre had lived her entire 43 years in the small village of Rieux, France, building a reputation as the most skilled healer for miles around. A woman whose knowledge of herbs, anatomy, and medicine seemed to transcend what any ordinary person should possess. Born to a family of peasant farmers, Margot had learned her craft from her grandmother, who had passed down generations of accumulated medical wisdom disguised as folk remedies and traditional healing practices. Margot's daily routine involved visiting the sick throughout the surrounding countryside, carrying a leather satchel filled with carefully prepared herbs, tinctures, and salves that she had spent years perfecting through trial and observation. She knew which plants could reduce fever, which combinations could ease the pain of childbirth, and which treatments could heal infected wounds that local physicians had declared hopeless. Her success rate was remarkable for the time period, with patients recovering from illnesses that typically proved fatal. The village of Rieux had come to depend on Margot's services in ways that went far beyond simple medical care. She served as midwife for difficult births, counselor for family disputes, and advisor for agricultural problems that affected the community's survival. Women would seek her advice on everything from breastfeeding difficulties to protecting their crops from blight, while men consulted her about treating sick livestock and healing work-related injuries. Margot's knowledge extended beyond herbal remedies to include what would later be recognized as early surgical techniques and psychological counseling methods. She could set broken bones with a skill that surpassed trained physicians, diagnose internal ailments through careful observation of symptoms, and provide emotional support for patients suffering from what modern medicine would recognize as depression and anxiety disorders. The source of Margot's extraordinary abilities was a combination of natural intelligence, careful observation, and inherited knowledge that had been passed down through generations of women who had served as unofficial medical practitioners in their communities. She kept detailed mental records of which treatments worked for specific conditions, constantly refining her methods based on experience and results rather than relying on the theoretical frameworks that dominated formal medical education. However, Margot's very success made her suspect in the eyes of those who believed that such remarkable healing abilities could only come from supernatural sources. The Catholic Church taught that miraculous cures were either divine interventions or demonic deceptions, leaving little room for natural explanations of medical knowledge that exceeded what trained physicians could achieve. Local priests had occasionally questioned Margot about her methods, asking whether she prayed to saints for intercession or invoked divine assistance in her healing work. Margot always insisted that her abilities came from careful study of God's natural world rather than any supernatural intervention. But her explanations seemed insufficient to account for her remarkable success rate. The growing tension between Margot's practical medical achievements and the religious community's need to understand them in supernatural terms created an increasingly dangerous situation. As her reputation spread beyond Reux to surrounding villages and towns, she attracted attention from people who viewed unexplained healing abilities as evidence of either sainthood or witchcraft, and sainthood required official church recognition that was never going to come to a peasant woman. The stage was set for a confrontation that would transform Margot from beloved healer into condemned witch within a single night. On the evening of September 15th, 1491, Margot de la Barre received the most desperate summons of her career when a frantic servant arrived at her cottage begging her to come immediately to the castle of Baron Henri de Montclair, whose 8-year-old son was dying from a mysterious illness that had baffled every physician in the region. The boy had been suffering for 3 days from high fever, convulsions, and breathing difficulties that seemed to be worsening by the hour. Margot arrived at the castle to find the child in the final stages of what appeared to be a severe respiratory infection, possibly pneumonia or diphtheria, conditions that were almost invariably fatal in the 15th century. The boy's breathing was so labored that each breath required enormous effort. His fever was so high that he was delirious, and his parents had already begun making arrangements for his funeral. The castle's physician, a university-trained doctor from Paris, had exhausted his arsenal of traditional treatments, including bloodletting, purging, and the application of various poultices and medicines that had proven completely ineffective. He stood by helplessly as the child's condition continued to deteriorate, privately acknowledging that there was nothing more he could do within the bounds of accepted medical practice. Margot's examination of the child revealed symptoms that she had encountered before in her years of treating respiratory ailments. She recognized the specific pattern of breathing difficulty, the quality of the fever, and the nature of the child's distress as indicators of a condition that she had successfully treated in other patients using a combination of herbal remedies and practical nursing techniques. Working through the night, Margot administered a careful sequence of treatments that included steam inhalations with specific medicinal herbs, poultices applied to the chest to ease breathing, and carefully measured doses of fever-reducing medications that she had prepared from plants growing in the local countryside. She also positioned the child to improve his breathing and provided constant care that maintained his body temperature and hydration levels. By dawn, the child's fever had broken. His breathing had returned to normal, and he was sitting up in bed asking for food. A recovery so rapid and complete that everyone who witnessed it was stunned by what seemed to be an impossible medical miracle. The castle physician openly admitted that he had never seen anything like it, while the child's parents wept with gratitude and relief. However, the very completeness of the child's recovery created problems that Margot had not anticipated. The speed of his improvement, the dramatic nature of his transformation from near death to apparent health, and the failure of university-trained physicians to achieve similar results all combined to make her success seem supernatural rather than medical. Baron de Montclair, overjoyed by his son's recovery, but disturbed by its inexplicable nature, began asking questions about how Margot had achieved what trained doctors could not. His inquiries, meant to understand and perhaps document her methods, instead revealed the extent of her knowledge and the sophisticated nature of her treatments in ways that seemed impossible for an uneducated peasant woman to possess. The miracle that should have cemented Margot's reputation as a gifted healer instead became the evidence that would condemn her as a witch practicing forbidden arts. The transformation of Margot de la Barre from miraculous healer to accused witch began within hours of the child's recovery, as Baron de Montclair's household struggled to explain how an uneducated peasant woman had achieved what university-trained physicians could not. The Baron's initial gratitude quickly gave way to suspicion as he consulted with his chaplain, Father Antoine Dubois, about the theological implications of such an extraordinary cure. Father Dubois, a stern cleric who viewed any unexplained phenomena through the lens of diabolic conspiracy, immediately questioned whether Margot's success could have natural origins. He pointed out that the Church taught there were only three possible sources for miraculous healing: divine intervention through prayer and saintly intercession, natural medical knowledge as practiced by trained physicians, or demonic power granted to those who had made pacts with Satan. Since Margot had not prayed publicly for divine assistance and was clearly not a recognized saint, and since her methods had succeeded where trained physicians had failed, Father Dubois concluded that her abilities must be supernatural in origin. The speed and completeness of the child's recovery, rather than being evidence of Margot's skill, became proof that she had used forbidden knowledge to achieve results that surpassed human understanding. The chaplain's theological analysis was supported by his recollection of various suspicious incidents from Margot's past that suddenly seemed sinister when viewed through the lens of witchcraft accusations. Her unusual success rate with difficult cases, her knowledge of herbs and treatments that seemed to exceed what an uneducated woman should possess, and her ability to heal conditions that trained physicians couldn't treat, all became evidence of demonic assistance. Baron de Montclair found himself in an impossible position, grateful for his son's life, but increasingly convinced that it had been saved through diabolic means. Father Dubois argued that accepting help from a witch, even unknowingly, endangered the Baron's soul and potentially contaminated his entire household with diabolic influence. The only way to cleanse himself of this spiritual pollution was to renounce Margot's assistance and ensure that she faced appropriate punishment for her crimes against God. The Baron's decision to turn against Margot was motivated not just by religious fear, but by political necessity. As a nobleman, he couldn't afford to be associated with accusations of witchcraft, which could damage his reputation and relationships with the church hierarchy. Protecting his family's honor required sacrificing the woman who had saved his son's life. Word of the accusation spread quickly through the local community, where Margot's neighbors found themselves forced to choose between defending someone they had known and trusted for years, or protecting themselves from association with suspected witchcraft. Fear proved stronger than loyalty as people who had benefited from Margot's healing suddenly remembered suspicious details about her behavior and methods. The village priest, Father Michel, who had previously tolerated Margot's work as beneficial to his parishioners, now faced pressure from higher church authorities to investigate and condemn her activities. What had once seemed like Christian charity and natural medical knowledge was reinterpreted as evidence of diabolic conspiracy and heretical practices. By evening, the transformation was complete. Margot de la Barre was no longer the village healer who had saved a child's life. She was a dangerous witch who had used Satan's power to achieve results that defied God's natural order. As darkness fell on September 16, 1491, the accusations against Margot de la Barre had transformed into a mob of torch-wielding villagers determined to rid their community of the diabolic influence they now believed had contaminated their midst. The speed with which suspicion had turned to certainty and certainty to violent action revealed how quickly medieval communities could transform gratitude into murderous rage when fear and superstition overcame reason and compassion. Father Dubois led the mob to Margot's cottage, carrying a crucifix and holy water, while proclaiming that they were acting as soldiers of Christ against Satan's servant. The crowd included many people who had benefited from Margot's healing over the years, but fear of being associated with witchcraft had transformed them into her most vicious accusers. They shouted that her unnatural medical knowledge was proof of diabolic pacts and that her success in healing had come at the cost of her soul. Margot's attempts to defend herself only strengthened the mob's conviction of her guilt. When she tried to explain her medical methods, citing the natural properties of herbs and her years of careful observation, her accusers heard only evidence of forbidden knowledge that no mortal woman should possess. Her calm demeanor in the face of their accusations was interpreted as diabolic influence, protecting her from the fear that any innocent person would feel. The mob's justice was swift and brutal, reflecting the medieval belief that witchcraft was such a serious crime that normal legal procedures could be bypassed in favor of immediate action. They dragged Margot from her cottage to the village square, where they had already prepared a stake and gathered wood for the fire that would purify their community of her corrupting presence. Father Dubois offered Margot a final opportunity to confess her sins and renounce Satan, promising that genuine repentance might earn her the mercy of strangulation before burning, rather than the agony of being burned alive. Margot's refusal to confess to crimes she had never committed was taken as final proof of her diabolic allegiance and her determination to serve Satan even unto death. The burning itself was conducted with the ritualistic solemnity that medieval communities believed necessary for combating supernatural evil. Father Dubois sprinkled holy water around the stake and led prayers asking God to protect the community from diabolic retaliation, while Margot was bound to the stake with chains blessed by the church to prevent her demonic allies from rescuing her. As the flames rose around her, Margot's final words were not curses or invocations of Satan, but prayers asking God to forgive her accusers and protect the child whose life she had saved. Her dignity and courage in the face of agonizing death impressed even some of her executioners, though they interpreted her composure as evidence of diabolic assistance rather than human strength. Margot de la Barre died as the sun rose on September 17, 1491, less than 24 hours after she had saved a child's life through medical knowledge that her community could not understand or accept. Her ashes were scattered to prevent her grave from becoming a site of diabolic veneration, and her cottage was burned to cleanse the earth of her corrupting presence. The child, whose recovery had triggered her execution, grew up to become a physician himself, eventually understanding that Margot had died for possessing medical knowledge that was centuries ahead of her time. The next time you take modern medicine for granted, remember Margot de la Barre, a woman who died for the crime of knowing how to heal when healing seemed like magic. Her story reminds us that knowledge without understanding can be more dangerous than ignorance, and that fear can transform heroes into monsters in the span of a single night. If this tragic tale of expertise punished as witchcraft shocked you, smash that like button. Subscribe for more untold stories of women destroyed by their own abilities, and hit that notification bell, because the most important lessons come from remembering those who died for being ahead of their time. What other historical figures do you think were persecuted for knowledge that seemed impossible? Share your thoughts in the comments below.